So, good evening again. Thank you. See, I grew up in the Pentecostal movement. There's this thing called call and response, so I'm going to try that one more time. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. That lets me know that people are alive in this room, in this space. I really appreciate you all coming out this evening and spending your time with us. Hopefully, for our next event, this is the beginning of our series of conversations, that you bring someone with you. Bring one or two people. We're getting the Facebook communications there and available, so you can certainly share it on Facebook with those. That's something, that's space and place that's not my comfort zone, so I don't do a whole lot of that. I'm a face-to-face trying to share this particular work. But I am Sean Sorrell. I am a Woodbury resident, and I get the great opportunity to collaborate with not only the city, the county, the Woodbury Community Foundation, as well as the YMCA, in collaboration with this particular work, and plenty of residents across our community that has come together to make this evening happen. And before we get started, I'd like for those individuals, I won't call you out by name, but I would like you to just stand so we can recognize who we're talking about that's a part of the Woodbury Racial Equity Collaborative. Thank you. Thank you all for making this happen, so thank you. So with that being said, and without further ado, this tonight is an event that is for the Woodbury Racial Equity Collaborative. And tonight's event is the Racial Equity and Affordable Housing Series, How We Got Here, a historic perspective on discriminatory housing practices. You may have heard of Mapping Prejudice. We have a great presenter this evening who's going to share some of that information with us. They're going to start with a 20 to 30-minute presentation that you're going to see here momentarily. I think it's very informative, very interactive in the sense of things that you might see or not know. Or might be some things that just validate or affirm some of the things you do know. After that presentation, it's going to be a facilitated conversation between the two of us that you all will witness. But after that, then you will share what you saw in this particular space with one another in some sort of what we call think, pair, share. And basically, you're going to think about a set of questions, which you see on those cards that you picked up coming in, and you're going to share and respond to those answers to those questions. And then we're going to come back as a large group and kind of wrap up and talk about some of our next steps. But as I mentioned, this is the Woodbury Racial Equity Collaborative. It began with leadership from the Woodbury Community Foundation and the Y coming together, both with community leaders and city and county government, public safety, nonprofits, school districts, public health, local business communities to begin conversations around racial equity in Woodbury. We started at least 18 months ago in this work with around 35 or so leaders across our community that came together. And really we started with the question is, as Woodbury becomes a more diverse community, what do we need to address to ensure that Woodbury is a welcoming community where all feel included and valued? That was the opening question that we started with this particular work. Out of that work, and one Saturday morning when we all came together, we then formed a steering committee, and then out of that steering committee, we came up with some action plans. And we came together and did some planning with some 4 overarching goals, in which is, 1, to identify the inequities around affordable housing in Woodbury. That may be a shocker for some of us, but that is an issue in our community, and we'll talk more about that through this series of conversations. 2 is to develop an engagement plan to deliver key messages and resources. We want more people and more of our community to be not only in the spaces, but informed about the work that we're trying to do in our community. 3, research experts to help deliver community learning around racial equity and inclusion. We have some amazing experts in our community already and would like you to learn from them, as well as if you are one of those individuals that we may have missed in this particular space, we certainly want to learn from you around racial equity and inclusion. And then finally, 4, develop a funding plan to support the ongoing work. We want this to be community-led. We want the community to bring this work together. So how do we fund that? There's multiple ways to do that through the Woodbury Community Foundation, but also through the efforts and work of the Woodbury Racial Equity Collaborative. So you can sign up for those things online. Without further ado, I want to introduce our presenter this evening, Rebecca. Rebecca Gillette is an Associate Director of the Community Engagement Lead for Mapping Prejudice. So that's what you're going to be learning about this evening. Her work focuses on shaping the relationship between the project team and its community partners and stakeholders, including designing, recruiting, leading, and assessing a new Community Fellows program. She is a veteran community engagement professional with deep knowledge of Black and Indigenous history in Minnesota and practical experience with the co-creative process central to public history. And prior to her work in that particular space, she worked with the Minnesota History and Science, if I'm not mistaken, what is it? History and Historical Society, thank you, of Minnesota, where she focused on establishing and building relationships with Twin Cities African American communities. She supported community initiatives defined and designed by Black leaders and community organizations, as well as members of the Equity and Inclusion Council, and worked with 3 internal colleagues to co-produce the initiative, Black History, Black Voices. We have a litany of achievements by our presenter today, but last but not least, I want to share a little bit about Mapping Prejudice, and it's based in the University of Minnesota Libraries. It's a team of historians, geographers, librarians, digital humanists, and community activists seeking to expose structural racism. Mapping Prejudice began in 2016 and drew on the tools of digital humanities and the tenets of public history to develop a methodology that identifies and maps racial covenants. So I want you to join me in welcoming Ms. Rebecca Gillette.
Thank you so much for having me here today, and I just want to say I speak in all different types of locations, church basements, auditoriums, from big to small, and I have to say this is the first time I get a waterfall in the back, that kind of the ambiance. So I really appreciate you inviting me here today. The other thing I just want to mention is I'm going to be doing a little multitasking. So I'm going to try to switch the slides from here and look here, but they're not connected. So bear with me. Can everybody hear me, or should I move the microphone in a little bit more? I can do that. I can, or I can hold it. Maybe I could hold it. Yeah. Yes, and I have hearing issues, so I always say, no, you need a mic. So I will practice what I preach. So again, thank you for inviting me here tonight. My name is Rebecca. I'm the community engagement lead here in the Twin Cities at Mapping Prejudice. So before I begin my presentation, I just wanted to start. Let's see if I can, again, this is where we're going to practice in the beginning. I want to just recognize first that we're situated on Minnesota Makoche, which is the ancestral homeland of the Dakota people. And one of the things that you may have heard around the community is land acknowledgements, which has taken really a long time for people to sort of develop and build as a practice. What's really interesting is I hear a lot now from Native colleagues who say that they have almost become a little bit performative. And so one of the things, so I wanted to just state that to say rather than read a long and perfectly crafted acknowledgement, I would really invite and direct all of us, including myself, to really just take the time to learn more about Dakota and the Dakota and Ojibwe people of Minnesota, and to seek ways in which we as a community can help repair the harms committed. I'm based out of the University of Minnesota, and so we are really a part of that, some of the trauma that is, and the land that has been taken. We have colleagues who just came out with the Truth Report, which is a 600-page document that talks about the university's complicity in taking land. So if anybody's interested, I didn't put them out on the table, happy to give you some information afterwards about that. So I say that today we're going to be talking about housing equity in the 20th century. So before I start, at its core, this is the history of land being reserved for white people. So it's important that I start with this. It's going to be the double click. So I really want to start by centering us today in the Twin Cities. The Twin Cities is one of the most prosperous cities in the country. And I would say if we claim to be prosperous, then really everyone should prosper, right? But when you look at the Twin Cities metro home ownership, there are huge disparities. 76% of white families own their own home, and only 28% of black families can make the same claim. Twin Cities has among the highest gaps between white and black homeownership rates in the nation. So the work that we do at Mapping Prejudice is about examining the roots of this history so that we can make sense of these contemporary statistics. Our current disparities are rooted in critical turning point at the beginning of the 20th century, and that was the decision to create and use private contracts to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people. So these private contracts were called racial covenants, which are clauses that were inserted into property deeds, such as this example that you see here, to keep people who are not white from buying or occupying certain pieces of land. For most of the 20th century, they were composed and promoted by a huge cast of characters: realtors, city planners, bankers, and elected officials. This is going to teach me to slow down when I speak, because I've got to do. So racial covenants worked in concert with other practices, like white violence, real estate steering, and redlining, to keep people who are not white from owning land and homes. Oops, let's see if I can, there we go. The earliest racial covenant that we found in Minnesota was put into place in South Minneapolis in 1910. That's when Henry and Lenora Scott sold a property at 35th Avenue South to Nels Anderson, a Swedish baker, and the home was very modest. But the deed for this property included this racial restriction, which is pictured here, that stipulated the party of the second part. Oops, I'm gonna try this again, sorry, there we go. And I'm gonna switch it there, sorry. The party of the second part, oh, I might have to have a sorry jar. Every time I say that, I'll put a quarter in. The party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not be at any time conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. Said restrictions shall run with the land. So I'd like to provide a bit of translation for one of these terms in particular. Mongolian was an early 20th century term to describe one of the, quote, races of man, end quote. It was meant to refer to people from Asia. We don't know for sure, but in this context, it could have referred to Native Americans. These ideas about race were developed by academics at prominent research institutions, including the University of Minnesota. This particular covenant was written by a property developer named Edmund Walton. Again, we can't get into his head to know whether or not he got the inspiration for these racial terms from people at the university, but we can say that the intention of the words is clear. They were written to keep anyone who is not seen as white from owning this land. Walton inserted this same language into thousands of other deeds in Hennepin and Ramsey counties. Across Minnesota, hundreds of landowners, developers, and city officials followed Walton's lead. They composed dozens of variations on the language he first put to text. So I want to show you some additional examples of racial covenants, but before I do, it's important to state that the language you will see is racist. I'm reading them not to inflict pain, but rather to bear witness to this practice and history. No person of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. No person No person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race that are domiciled with an owner or tenant. And here you can see the language appear directly on an open advertisement for the sale of land. Fourth, the grantee cannot sell or lease said real estate to a colored person. You have my assurance that the above restrictions will be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. So you can see that this is no secret. Covenants were advertised as amenities, and they send a message as to who gets to participate in the construct of whiteness. Looking at and reading the language of these covenants aloud is the first step if we want to move forward. We need to confront this racism and acknowledge that it had the intended impact. For those who have firsthand experience with the consequences of this text, I hope that this public acknowledgement will be both affirming of your lived experience and empowering going forward. We all can now respond to denials that this history didn't exist or take place by simply responding with, "Don't believe me then. Look at the primary source documents that you all have just seen." The Fair Housing Act of 1968 made covenants illegal. Once this happened, there was a rush to forget, at least among white people. Our team is working on peeling back this willful amnesia and empowering communities to engage in collective remembering. We're trying to create data to help communities of color demand change. One important thing to acknowledge about covenants is that they were not a secret when they were in use, but rather a selling point. So I laid the basic foundation of what racial covenants are and where they were located in property records. I'd like to move forward in time and talk a little bit about our work and mission. Mapping Prejudice, as Sean mentioned, was started in 2016, really as an experiment, merging public history and technology as a transformative narrative about our history of structural racism. Our team resolved to do something no one had ever done before, and that was to build the first ever comprehensive map of racial covenants for an American city. But we still wanted to know, what did racial covenants actually say? Where were they used? How common were they? How much land did they cover? And we decided to answer these questions in an unconventional way. We took digitized property records from Hennepin County and used computers to flag documents that seemed to have racist language. And then we harnessed the power of community. We put the property records that we flagged into a crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse. This platform allowed us to invite volunteers from all backgrounds into the work. To date, over 8,000 volunteers have identified and mapped close to 40,000 property records that contain a racial covenant. When we put this information on a map, this is what we saw. So this is a contagion map, and contagion means really the spreading of harmful ideas or practices. So looking at this contagion map, you can see the spread of racial covenants over Minneapolis and St. Paul, Hennepin, Ramsey County. And from a high level, you can really see how intentionally adding racial covenants to these property deeds created exclusive spaces surrounding and within the city for white people. And this is from about 1910 to the 1950s. The number of property records found with racial covenants is going up all the time. Today, volunteers are reading property deeds from Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, and Dakota County, Minnesota. The patterns laid down by the covenants persist today and define where the best resourced areas are. And when I say that, I mean education, health, green space, all defined by where our home is located. So it's important to understand, there we go. It's important to understand how powerful they were. Covenants ran with the land. Once they were embedded into the property deeds, it didn't matter how many times the property changed hands or what was built on the parcel of land. Anyone who breached a covenant, even after the property changed hands several times, they risked ending up in court and losing all the equity that they had acquired in the property. A breach triggered a process that put the land back in the hands of the person who put the covenant in place. And if that person died, it would go to their heirs. People often ask if there was resistance from white people to these covenants. And this is significant in acknowledging this history. Covenants had overwhelming support from white people. Opinion surveys in the 1940s show that most white people in Minnesota believed covenants were beneficial. Racial restrictions, they believed, protected property values and neighborhood harmony. There's an idea that American cities have always been segregated, and that the further back in time you go, the more segregated things were. But that's actually not true. Black people were able to initially settle in many parts of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and you can see this here in 1910. Beginning in the teens and 20s, Black people were then forced into smaller and smaller spaces. Here we go. Neighborhoods with covenants are still the whitest in Minneapolis and St. Paul today. The pattern established by 1940 through covenants, real estate steering, and white violence persists today. As covenants were developing, there were just as many instances of racist white violence over Black-owned property as reported in Minneapolis newspapers. You can see these examples here during the 4-year span of 1908 to 1912. Black people, by contrast, saw covenants as a threat to fundamental liberty. In Minnesota, Black leaders like Nellie Francis, who in 1921 led efforts to enact the state anti-lynching statute. Too many clicks, I'm just gonna. Lena Olive Smith, who was the first African-American woman to practice law in 1921 and was the attorney during the 1931 Arthur Lee case, which I will share in a moment. And Katie McQuad, who served for 17 years with the St. Paul NAACP and Urban League, and in 1964 was the first Black candidate to run and win a St. Paul City Council seat. All devoted their lives to fighting these practices. So these leaders are examples of resistance through the channels in which they had the most agency. There were other stories of Black resistance by courageous individuals. This is what Arthur and Edith Lee did in 1931 when they bought a small bungalow at 4600 Columbus Avenue in South Minneapolis with a contract for deed. This is a 1964 example of a standard contract for deed. For those of you who don't know what a contract for deed is, and I didn't before I owned a home, it's when the buyer, in the case of the Lee family, they make payments to the owner until the house is entirely paid off and legally becomes theirs. Sometimes it's referred to as rent to own. Buyers had all the responsibilities of home ownership, but at any time, if a missed payment happened, they could lose the house. The original seller could keep the profits, and then the seller could create the same arrangement with a new buyer. It was yet another predatory lending practice that impacted Black families all over the country. So what this meant was the Lee family was in a very vulnerable position. For the Lees, they had an unrecorded contract for deed, which is the quieter route for sellers to profit. So they took a risk to live in a comfortable neighborhood for their family. When neighbors found out that the Lees, a black family, was moving in, they organized to stop the sale. They called the realtor, the bank, the city council, and other neighbors. When the Lees ignored the neighborhood threats and moved into their house, they found themselves under attack. Thousands of people gathered around the house. They tried to burn it down. They threatened to murder the Lee family. They shot out the windows and threw black paint on the siding. The photo on the left shows Edith Lee with her daughter Mary in front of the house after one of these attacks. You can also see the broken window in the corner of the photo. The Lees held on for 2 years, after which time they finally succumbed to the pressure and moved. Before the Lees moved into their neighborhood in 1964, there were federal actions that set the stage for the neighborhood violence they faced. So typically, when purchasing a house in the early 20th century, buyers had to pay for the house within 5 years. So when the Federal Housing Administration, created by Congress in 1934, it in essence changed this tight timeline in which buyers had to pay in full for their house. The administration created the modern mortgage, in which buyers could pay equal fixed payments for a 15 to 30-year period of time. It was also good for banks or savings and loans companies, who could offer cheaper mortgages to people with FHA insurance covering them. This new structure made it more accessible to home buyers. However, this change in practice was not open to black families. This was because the FHA had incorporated racist ideas into the home appraisal industry that opposed the, quote, mixing of races, which in turn meant the decline of property values. Many of you might be familiar with these images. These are the Holk redlining maps. So 3 years after the creation of the FHA, these maps emerged. They're actually more descriptive than prescriptive, because they were actually the ideas of lenders. And these maps actually, a lot of people don't know this, but they actually were sent to Washington and sort of put in a box for many years that people didn't know they existed. But they gave you a sense of what the thinking was of the time from all the people in the real estate industry and the loan officers and the banks. Federal writing guidelines stipulated that racially mixed neighborhoods were hazardous investments for lenders, thus the red line equaling hazardous. These baked-in guidelines often choked off capital to black neighborhoods, which were described as hazardous. Lack of access to capital depressed property values. So all of this meant that it was harder for people who lived in so-called redlined areas to accumulate wealth through property ownership. White spaces became places of investment, while non-white spaces are areas of divestment. It also made these areas targets for other forms of discrimination. We talked about legacies of covenants, we've talked about white violence, we've talked about federal agencies who created formal and informal laws that strengthened segregation. Then came the construction of highways and freeways, which tore through traditional black neighborhoods in Minneapolis and St. Paul, displacing families and adding convenient and intentional physical barriers between white and black neighborhoods. All of the systemic decisions and intentional acts show enduring demographic patterns. Think about all the things that you have or don't have access to in your neighborhood: schools, health, green space, food sources or food deserts, tree canopy. With all of the overlays that I'm showing, you start to see that access to resources and opportunities are based on where you live. The patterns established by 1940 through covenants, real estate steering, illustrated by the redlining maps and white violence, all persist today. Our work at Mapping Prejudice focuses not only on identifying mapping racial covenants, but also unearthing public history narratives that illuminate racist tools in the system's toolbox to keep black families from ownership, homeownership, access to resources, and the ability to pass down generational wealth. So I've shared a lot of history on how these systems have interacted over time. I always think that humanizing all of this can help illustrate the impact it had on Black and white families with different embedded and understood rules. So I'd like to share a little bit about my family. In 1963, my mom and dad, Scotty and Peter Gillette, purchased this house in the Kenwood neighborhood of South Minneapolis. They paid $22,000 with a low-interest loan of 4.5%. They were also helped by a gift of $2,000 from my grandpa as a down payment for the house. They had 3 girls, including me, and were able to sell the house for a significant profit, which could then be invested in future homes that over time then also were sold and profit yet again. Each time the house was sold, my parents could accumulate wealth that they could then reinvest in their future and that of my 2 sisters and me. Ultimately, their investments were used to help each of us when we were older and ready to purchase our own homes. So I benefited from this privilege that is presented in our history books as normative. The gift from my grandpa to help buy our house was also not unusual. In fact, down payment support is not exceptional. 30% of white people get family help to buy their first home. Oops, let's see if I can, there we go. So this is Elsie and Willie Joe Sellers, my mother and father-in-law. They came to Minnesota from Arkansas and Tennessee as part of the Great Migration of African American people seeking opportunity and home ownership for their families in the North. In 1965, after renting with their 3 young children, including my husband, Elsie and Willie Joe purchased this house at 4736 Oakland Avenue on the edges of the Old South Side, the historically Black neighborhood in South Minneapolis. They bought the house on an unrecorded contract for deed for $7,500 with an 18-year term. So here you can see where I grew up in relationship to where my husband grew up, and I just want to note all the green dots are locations of racial covenants in the Twin Cities. So I want to put my husband's neighborhood in context. Up the block from the Sellers at 4553, doing the Oakland lived Belvin and Betty Norris, who bought their house a few years before my in-laws. Their daughter, Michelle Norris, who would become nationally celebrated journalist, who you might remember from NPR's All Things Considered, was born a few months after Belvin and Betty moved in. Michelle writes in her book, her memoir about their home, quote, "We weren't trying to be activists," my mother said. "We just decided it was time to live in someplace nice. We worked hard with white people at the post office who could live wherever they wanted. We wanted to do the same. We wanted to show them that we were just as good as they were," end quote. Elsie and Willie Joe were also trying to be, not to be activists. 1 block away, they simply wanted a home for their family. Remember a few blocks, let's see if I can do this, double-handed. I just mentioned the mention of the Norris home, and then you heard me earlier talk about the Lee home, which was also close by. I want to point out again that there are no covenants in any of these properties, but often the covenants we say create kind of a halo effect. They're not necessary because there's a circle around the neighborhood. So interestingly enough, I just think it's interesting, my husband's family did not know the history that came before them from the Lee family. So there's kind of a question of did that history kind of live on within the community? Let's see if I can more. So my mother and father-in-law, Elsie and Willie Joe Sellers, made good on those payments. And for financial needs throughout the years, they unfortunately had other mortgage arrangements. At one time in 1987, they took out a 5-year mortgage for roughly $8,000 at an astonishing interest rate of 21.75%. And for comparison, an average mortgage rate today might be around 7%. They hung on to the house until 2013, when they were foreclosed because of medical expenses. So after 47 years of my in-laws living in their home, my husband and his two sisters walked away with a mere $5,000. So this is a picture of my family. We are the children of Scotty and Peter Gillette and Elsie and Willie Joe Sellers. Our two family narratives, one of privilege and one of the recipient of racist policies, illustrate the same history of racialized housing and the contemporary impact of the homeownership gap between Black and white families. Our family stories tell on a human level how the system, but really two systems, impacted our parents, my mom and dad, Scotty and Peter, who as white people had access to all of the resources, were supported by laws and policies, and had no idea that their world was nothing other than normal. Versus my in-laws, Elsie and Willie Joe, who understood the racist housing playbook they had to work within, yet resisted until the end. Our parents' experiences also had a direct impact on what was or wasn't passed on to me and my husband, which then impacts what we as parents can pass on to our two children when they're ready to purchase a house. Generational wealth that could have potentially supported their futures in a more stronger way. Thanks to Black activism and resistance, covenants have been illegal everywhere in the country since 1968. That's when Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which made covenants illegal. But the impact is still evident. I just want to leave with a quote starting here a year before the Fair Housing Act passed. Martin Luther King published a book in which he stated, "Many of the ugly pages of American history have been obscured and forgotten. A society is always eager to cover misdeeds with a cloak of forgetfulness, but no society can really repress an ugly past when the ravages persist into the present." This is why I do my job and why presenting this shared history is so important to me. First and foremost, not to forget the impact of racial covenants today. So I end, and we'll probably get into discussion, with a few questions that I will put, is what can you do? What can I do? So now that we collectively know this history and understand its ripple effect, what are the tools that each of us collectively or individually have to make change today? So I'll just leave that here, knowing that we're going to continue this conversation. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Appreciate the knowledge and wisdom you just shared. I want to give you all a moment to, as I mentioned, to think, pair, and share. There were little cards that if you did not pick up coming in, they're on the table, or someone near you hopefully have one. And basically what I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you some time here, around 10 minutes or so, to pair up with someone near you. And I want you to think about what you just experienced with regards to the historical context that you were given around racial covenants. And I want you to answer the two questions. One is, what caught your attention during the presentation? I want you to think about what caught your attention during the presentation. Share that with each other. I want you to take turns in sharing that. So pair up with someone, and then answer also the second question is, what surprised you and why? So I'm going to give you about 5 to 10 minutes to do that, and then we're going to come back as a large group. Going to have a conversation here with Rebecca. And then on the back of the card, there's an opportunity for you to write down any questions that you may have. And if we get an opportunity to answer those questions during this session, we will. If not, there is a box at the top of the table that you signed in, where you can put those questions in, and we'll work to get responses back to you all. So I want to give you roughly 5 to 10 minutes, which would be, let's say 7 minutes. Let's go ahead and say 7 o'clock. We're going to come back as a large group and continue our conversation together. So that's 9 minutes to give you to pair up with someone. And perhaps it would be a little adventurous to talk with someone you don't know. Like not your spouse, Matt. But anyway, thank you. So go right ahead. This is your 2-minute warning, 2 minutes. Well, thank you for your work. I know that 10 minutes is not enough time, is it? You all are like, oh my goodness, is time up already? Or perhaps there's some of us that went on to talking about the upcoming football season, but we're not going to go there. We're going to, no, oh, did I overhear a conversation? No, there wasn't. It's all connected, right? Thank you all for taking that time. I'm going to have you come back. One of the things I didn't share before I sent you into those small group conversations was what is the correlation in this work around racial equity? Why now? Why? Because, and many may think we've been the epicenter, certainly since the murder of George Floyd, in various news and pieces that have come out about our community. But I like to hearken back to some things that was presented to you by Rebecca, and I want to share with you a few things to consider. And it's often I get the opportunity to talk about this work on the other side of the river, that is, as you referenced, Hennepin County, Minneapolis, and in that particular space. And that is, how is this work all interconnected when you're talking about disparities, right, and inequities, not only racial, but let's just talk about with regards to gender. Women, in particular, gained the right to work or acceptance to work after World War I. But that's 1918, if you don't remember those particular numbers. And because of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the real conversation around equal pay. But it is 2023, and we still have the conversation around equal pay for women. And that's still a conversation and still a fight in our community. But the difference when it comes to talking about, when we speak of these racial covenants, that has also gone on for generations. And there's been laws, and that was actually in 68 years after when we talk about the Civil Rights Act. We're still talking about, though racial covenants, much like unequal pay is illegal, unenforceable when you talk about those things, but to fight that or to prove unequal pay or even prove that I did not get housing because of my race is a challenge. My point to trying to talk to about that interconnectedness is, in our society today, we're quickly to want to say, as in the presentation, erase that historical context and say, hold on, you can live where you want to live. Women are achieving and getting paid the same as men, right? No, that's not the case in our society. So that's why, for me, the interconnectedness of these inequities both racial, gender, and otherwise, is extremely important, and why we can't erase the historical context of it all, because that's how we're going to come together and figure out we do need to make a change, because you're talking about hundreds of years, or excuse me, nearly 100 years, around women's ability to work outside the home and racial covenants, and we're still having this conversation, right? So I want to appreciate you taking the time to have that conversation. Hopefully you all have made some connections. I forgot to mention, if you needed a pen to write one, I have several pens to write a question down. But I'm going to have a short conversation with Rebecca and then invite you all back into the conversation with us. So again, Rebecca, thank you for the presentation and the time you spent with us thus far of sharing with us. So a little bit of data things that I was looking up with regards to home ownership when it calls with regards to racial inequities there. Many may not know where Minnesota lands with that, so I just wanted to share a few numbers. We are well below states that have historically been known as quote-unquote racist states, or have high racial systemic issues, such as South Carolina and Mississippi. But if anyone recalls what our number was with regards to racial inequities, South Carolina is actually at the top with regards to African American home ownership at 54.8%. Mississippi is at 43%, and if you recall, Minnesota was at 28%. The national average is 41%. Wisconsin is 28.6%. Just wanted to throw that in there for obvious reasons. So I share all of that with the group and some things that you probably know about those particular numbers. But what can you tell us about what you know about our current situation with regards to Washington County in particular, with racial covenants? Where are we in this mapping prejudice project? Or you can take mine.
Or I'll take yours. We'll just do a little switch. Okay. Thanks for the question. So we are grant funded, and we have a grant to map all of the 7-county metro area. So we've completed Hennepin County and Ramsey County. We're working on Dakota County right now, and with Washington County, we need digitized property records from the property record specialists in each county. And Washington County has given those to us. And so we right now have kind of communicated back and would love help in getting a response, because what we just need for our computing processes, we need document numbers and we need page numbers. And that might sound really simple. But what we do in our process is that we're able to use words through optical character recognition with these digitized property records. So if we say we put the word white in, it will flag the documents that have that word in it. And then we use volunteers to look at these documents and read through to find out, was white significant enough that it flagged a covenant, or was it just Mr. and Mrs. White, or White Bear Lake, or something like that. And then we get all the information, the date, the lot, the block, the name, the owners, the sellers, and then the property record number. And so what that does is it allows us to map that each of those lots in Woodbury. So we're excited to work with Washington County, and we want to get started. And we're just kind of waiting to hear if we can get a new run of the deeds with that information, and then we can start processing them. So we're anxious to do that. So
great, thank you. Thank you for sharing that bit of information, and that's a little bit of homework for us to do as a community to help get some of that information to you. But earlier we were having a conversation about even that processing and documenting it, and you were sharing a little bit about who actually is doing some of that work and some of the challenges with having those who have been adversely affected around these covenants also coming in to the table to do some of that work. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
thank you. So I think I mentioned we've had over 8,000 volunteers, and we're 3 full-time people. So it really is those 8,000 people that have helped us that is critical to the work. And part of the process is identifying the racial covenants, but even more importantly is then the conversation, or equally important is the conversations, just like we're doing tonight. And so what we do is we invite people in to learn how to transcribe. So we do these free training sessions online for anybody who wants. There's some information up there. And then we talk about what surprised you, what did you see, just exactly what you're talking about. And I think the challenge right now is that I would say the predominant makeup of the audience that helps us volunteer are predominantly probably middle-aged white folks who come, which is great. And I would say some family and friends would say, yeah, you know what, that's your work to do. We have to live this, you do the work. And yet we do have people of color who join us in these sessions, smaller amount, and I'm wanting to make sure that I care. I'm about a year new in this position, and so I'm trying to figure out how can we create spaces where people of color feel safe so that they don't have to process some of the comments and feelings that come up. And then white people need to be able to talk about this too. I think it's really important that there's a space that we as a white person, I can lead a group in processing some of their thoughts. So still working through that, I think, a little bit, but we try to take care, just as I did in my presentation, to say, I'll often say in the sessions, you know, we're gonna read this because it's important for people to understand this language. And if this is painful or too much emotional labor that it put on you, and you don't feel like this is a right space, you are welcome to leave. You can step away and come back, because we don't want to trigger emotions, I guess I would say. So. Oh.
Let's see. Maybe not. We'll share. Okay, as we're working through our technology, which is okay. Thanks again, for sharing that particular piece, because we all need to be a part of this work, but only as much as we can take on it and bear through it. I want to talk a little bit more personally with you with regards to just your feelings about the project. So I want to talk about those gut feelings, right? Those reactions. So as you mentioned, you've been doing this work for a year, and I love how you put your family's story in this, and your spouse's family story in this, as well as the other families around you in this story. So it's really personal for you. So I'd really like to know, what has been your gut reaction to the project outcomes thus far?
Well, especially as somebody who's new to the work, again, a year, it's been a huge learning curve, and learning the content, because if you think of this history, it deals with real estate, land, property, public history, historical narratives, family stories. So for me, it's been a little bit of a fire hydrant in trying to, my boss just continues to give me more books to read, and they just keep, I think I was, of course, shocked and saddened when I had our property record specialist do some digging on my own families, and I think that was painful to see, because I loved my in-laws, and it brought up feelings of anger too, that they were doing everything they could in a system that was difficult. So there's a personal piece in that, and then how it impacts my children. But I also feel really strongly we make a case for reparations, and a lot of people ask, ooh, sometimes people have a hard time hearing reparations, and I always say it's repair work, and reparations can look different in so many different ways. It could be volunteering, it could be sharing this. Like, this is so important, this history, that we don't forget this history. It might be showing up at your neighborhood association and listening to the issues that are happening, or policy. We are not neutral, but we do the research. We collect the data, and we have lots of researchers who then use it to build on other issues that they want to talk about. And we're very transparent about it. We want to make sure that anybody and everybody who wants the data can use it. So I'm surprised by our lack of awareness of this history. I think that's the biggest thing. So I'm not alone if you feel like, wow, I never heard of this. We were never taught this. None of us were. And so that's really important to bring awareness to this history, I think, first and foremost. And I'm surprised right now because of, I think, our moment in time right now. There are states all across the country, 'cause covenants are everywhere in our country. And so there are states that are trying to find ways to manage this, either to document them, but also policies now that are taking place, specifically in California, that want to redact this information from the property record. And I think it's an emotional, like, let's get rid of it. Oh, this is horrible. And we always argue, no, don't redact it, because then you're erasing history. We need to confront this history. But what you can do is you can, what we call, discharge the covenant. So if you had one in your house, we work with this great organic coalition called Just Deeds, and it was a group of lawyers who came together to say, we will help with this process, the legal process, so that people don't have to be burdened with that. And you can discharge the document. So what it does is it creates a legal document that says, I, Rebecca Gillette, if I had one on my house, I don't, our family disavows this racist language. We refute it, we are against it, and then it goes into your title packet and lives with that. So you can see the historic record, but then when I sell my house to Sean, that legal document that I've created then travels with that as well. So it's an act, it's an act, a symbolic but important act of resistance by homeowners as well. Sorry, I could talk forever, so I should.
No, you're fine. I definitely see the passion that you have around this, and it's much needed conversation and work. And so I appreciate you sharing those very personal stories. And you actually went to that third leg of our words, right? We already put the religion word out there first with me sharing a little bit in our opening. And then we obviously talked about race throughout, especially when we're talking racial covenants. And then you spent time talking a little bit about reparations. So here's where I want to kind of share, or have you share. Reparations means repair, fix, heal. There was something that was a mess, whatever we want to term it as, but that's something that needs to be repaired. So can you tell us a little bit about some of your work with Mapping Prejudice, and how might this project support reparations? And as you mentioned earlier, it can look in many different ways, take on many different forms. It may not always be financial, right? But there's other ways that that can occur. So tell me how this project may help with the aspect of reparations.
I'm just pausing because I want to not repeat what I said a little bit, but I think there are, maybe giving examples might be helpful. So I gave you one example of Just Deeds, which is this powerful coalition that has come together of people after hours work, just like all of you who are a part of this, this group that you've formed, which is really wonderful. I'll tell you another sort of tentacle. So lots of tentacles come off of, we do the research, we provide the data, we find public history stories like the Lee family, things like that. And then there are other groups that sort of run with this. Sometimes we discover them later. So a great example would be Free the Deeds. So there's a Longfellow neighborhood in Minneapolis. The group came together and wanted to do something, and there were a lot of artists in the community. And so what they did is they came together using their talent, and they created yard signs that said Free the Deeds, and people could buy the yard sign if they discharged a covenant on their house. These beautiful signs, they put them in their front yard, and the cost of them then went to, oh, now I'm having just a old person freeze, a land, they put it into a pool of money that could be used for people who needed mortgage assistance or ways in which they could invest. So it's this beautiful circle of we do this research, a family learns about it, they take it off, they buy a sign, and then the money, and they educate people in their neighborhood to talk about this. And I would say Longfellow right now is working to find and work with families who still have covenants on their house to help them and to do it as a community so that people can learn from one another. And lots of researchers use this data too, so I should say all the way up to policymakers have used it.
Absolutely. So the last comment there was that policymakers also utilize this information for some of the legislative matters that's come before us and in their spaces. With that being my last actual question, I do want to give an opportunity to hear some voices in the space. If you happen to have a question that you'd like to have answered at this moment, if you raise your hand, I'll bring you the microphone, and we can take a shot at answering your question live. Any questions in the room? All right. Oh, I'll bring it. Or I can repeat it. Go for it. Okay, you have a lot to say. I'm going to bring you the mic.
When you get to Washington County and do your research, Tanner's Lake, which is in the shadow of the 3M, all those cabins have that clause in there. So that's how close it is to us here. So.
Thank you very much for sharing that. Anyone else? There's a question. I'm getting my steps in.
Rebecca, thank you for being here. This was great. A quick question. You had mentioned that the deeds need to be digitized. So my first thought was, what percentage of deeds are? And I assume there's a large subset that aren't, that don't even get reviewed. So long question. What percentage do you believe is really getting, looked at from a deed standpoint?
That's a great question. So we started in the 7-county metro area, and our goal, of course, is to do all of Minnesota. We actually have a partnership in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So it's just about staff capacity and time. So what really the first step is working with county recorder's office to find out if they have them digitized. So if they don't have them digitized, then we can't, and that has to come from the county. Now, maybe internally that could be, I don't know what the history has been, if there's been internal push to get them digitized. If they are digitized, they are public records, but it sounds so simple to just say, hey, could you just email them over? There's lots of negotiations that go back. We have an MOU, and we need to define some things, to make sure that because we're taking land from long ago and we're actually layering contemporary maps on top of it. This is my colleague Mike, who's a wizard, so I can't speak eloquently about it. I hope he doesn't hear this, but it's really taking, if you think of Woodbury has these windy roads, and then or no land, they're farmland, and now you're putting these grids on top of it. So he's got some magical formulas that he can do to put those together, and then that helps us identify the spaces. We've had an opportunity to work on the East Coast, but they have what's called meets and bounds land maps. It means nothing, I'm sure, to you. It didn't to me either. But it's kind of like, well, there was a space that was 10 feet by the tree, and then it wound around the corner, and then that gets to be really hard to layer a contemporary map on it. But first and foremost, we need digitized records in order to do this work. And some counties don't have the funds. It's expensive. So far in the metro area, we haven't had that issue, but we may find that as we go out into greater Minnesota. Thanks for the question.
We have time for one more question or comment.
Hi, my question is, and it's just, I'm just wondering, do people come across this ratio covenants today when they're buying homes, or have they all been removed?
So I think part of that is, one, they are outlawed. That's number one, so no one can actually, say that again? No new ones, right? But I'll let you answer the rest.
You ask an excellent question, because yes, they're illegal, and yes, there have been incidents where it might not be intentional, but people don't know that they're illegal. If you don't know that they are illegal, like we just got an article, we get flagged articles all the time with code word of covenants and things like that. And there was an example of a gentleman in the South who had a building, and he wanted to build an extension onto it to the next door property. And the property owner said, no, you can't. There's a racial covenant. You cannot. And so he says, oh, I can't. So it's kind of like neither knew that they were illegal. And I also think that I imagine, I'm going to just imagine, I can't give you facts, that if we know that there is steering that goes on in the real estate business, that, you know, I don't know what happens in a transaction between two people. So I will say that they are, if I remember correctly, sometimes if you looked at your packet and you might say, I don't have one, you often don't get your property records from, I think it's like 1940 to today. And you have to get those digitized records to see if they were before that. So, so that's where it gets a little, the law and the papers, it gets tricky. But I would say that yes, that in fact could happen, and there's been a couple of instances where we have heard that. So it's important that people, if that were to happen, I can't imagine it would, that you would say, I'd like to see the records, and you can also quote, all of you, 1968, they were outlawed, I'm sorry, that doesn't bear out today. Yeah.
You mentioned steering. You mind sharing a little bit more about that?
Well, real estate steering is really, it's biases that come into play in real estate transactions. So if you think of, if any of you have bought a house, you have a realtor who helps you find the house, and you're having conversations outside of official spaces. And I mean, I can say in the rental with my husband, as you all have heard about my family, that has in fact happened to us in rental properties. So it's who's having the interaction, and you may have all heard the stories of a black family who has a white friend who stages the house to do the sale, and suddenly so these come from internal biases that are also things that need to be addressed and worked on. Now I want to say one more thing. In the Just Deeds Coalition, a good friend, Jamar, who is in Edina Realty, they are working within the system of real estate to build in training, because the field of real estate is predominantly white, and so they are trying to build all the way up from the leadership some internal bias training and equity training and trying to flag all these things. So there's lots of work to be done in many of these different areas. And but I am grateful that someone like Jamar, who leads this in Edina Realty, is trying to make the change from the top down. So.
Well, again, let's thank Rebecca for sharing the information and time. I want to thank each of you for coming out for our first event. This is a series and a start of conversations, and we want to have another conversation later on after these first three series around how we might use this information that we're learning through these three series. So it's not just to have it and to say that we did it, check the box, okay, we have a community that's now more aware. That's one step in the process, but another step in the process is, what do we do with this information? How do we utilize it to inform our elected officials, our legislators, and what we'd like to see our community to look like as we move forward? I love what you have here, Rebecca, so I want to go back to that. What can you do? What can you do? There's several bullets up here. There's 6, 7 bullets up here. I'd like you to pick one. Just pick one that you can do after today. After you've gotten this message and this information, take one of those steps that you can do to not only educate yourself, but educate others what you have. There's quite a few handouts at the top of the steps for you there. Feel free to take one for yourself and one for someone else. But again, I will encourage each of you to next time bring a friend. Bring 2 friends. Share it on Facebook. We have some great links out there for you. Learn about some of the work that we're doing in our community and the conversations that we're trying to have. But we certainly need you to bring a friend so we continue this conversation and make Woodbury that place that we talk about where people feel like they belong and are included. With that, I want to say thank you, drive safely, and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.